Today's scripture reading is from Mark chapter 8, verse 27 to verse 31. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist. And others say, Elijah, and others, one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. This is the word of the Lord.
So I've been watching the news a little bit more recently. Not sure about you, but yeah, lots of things going on in the world, right? And in our nation. There's an election going on in a few weeks, of course. But even beyond that, there's lots of things that are just happening in this world. There's these new tariffs that the American president announced on Canadian goods, as well as every other nation in the world. It's this economic war that's been started, I think, this tariff war that economists tell us have not happened for a century or more. The severity of the international trade war that's going on or potentially going to happen has not happened for decades, if not a century or more. And then there were the threats of the annexation of Canada recently, last few weeks, that perhaps we might not even be a country. There's this threat that maybe we'll be the 51st state. And I think there's some instability that maybe some of us have not been accustomed to. Most of us, I think, have grown up most of our lives experiencing stability, peace, political rest. But suddenly it seems like there's this potential for instability. And lots of things seem to be happening and changing around us. A thought occurred to me this past week as I was reflecting on Jesus and the first century and then our context today. If we, as a free and sovereign nation for hundreds of years or a couple of hundred of years, long and established history, we have lots of support from other countries around the world. If we, as Canada, feel threatened and vulnerable as a nation because of the actions of this big neighbor that we have to the south, imagine how a little tiny nation, Israel, would have felt on the edge of the Roman Empire, the western edge of the Mediterranean Sea, insignificant compared to this behemoth empire of Rome. Not just the threat of annexation, but in fact, complete military and political domination had already occurred. It's not just heavy taxation, but really it's extraction, resources just going one way towards Rome. Their way of life, their culture, their language, their worship, all those things were under threat. One of the things that these last few weeks has, I think, given us maybe a small glimpse of is maybe something of what the Jewish people might have felt in that first century, living under Roman occupation and Roman power. And it's in that context that Jesus is living. In that context that Jesus comes into the scene. He comes and arrives at the Jewish capital at Jerusalem. And there he meets with fierce opposition. First, Jewish opposition, and then Roman opposition there in the city of Jerusalem, representing the capital of the empire, Rome. And there it is that Jesus is executed. He's charged with insurrection. That's a charge against him, that he is trying to foment resistance against Rome. He's trying to start a resistance and trying to overturn the empire. And that's what he is executed for. Now, the word insurrection for us probably doesn't have a lot of meaning until maybe not too long ago. January the 6th, 2021. Do you guys remember that day? Again, related to the president, Donald Trump. That was a day when hundreds of people stormed the U.S. Capitol. And it was really quite striking what was happening, almost unimaginable what was happening, that all these rioters, these protesters, stormed the U.S. Capitol, got all the way inside, and hundreds of people were arrested afterwards, people were killed. And what was a charge against Donald Trump in his impeachment? Insurrection. Now, in the end, he was acquitted of that. But just that moment in U.S. history, really, that very tense moment, that's a taste of what we're talking about, insurrection. This is a charge that Jesus was given. This is the charge with which he was executed. He was killed. Treason against the Roman Empire. Now, that's what we're talking about today, partly. We're talking about the suffering and the death of Jesus. Now, in this sort of mini-series that we're going through, last week Susan Reddy kicked it off for us, talking about Jesus and Jewish opposition as Jesus enters Jerusalem. Today we're talking about Jesus' suffering and death. Next week, Max will lead us in Jesus and his entrance into Jerusalem. Mike Woods will lead us on Good Friday, talking about Jesus and crucifixion. And then I talk about Jesus and resurrection on Easter Sunday. So this is our kind of moment as we're turning towards the cross, turning towards Easter in the larger series, Knowing Jesus. And that larger series has been about trying to understand Jesus in the context of his time, Jesus in the context of history. And really, it's kind of like taking the very bare bones of the things that we can know historically about Jesus and thinking about what can we learn from that? What does that speak to us today? So it's not just looking at the biblical text and thinking about how to understand the text better, but really thinking about Jesus in history. So as we get closer and closer to Easter, this is really the climax of the story of Jesus and the climax also of our series, because what we think about Jesus' death, how Jesus ends his life, really dictates our response to who Jesus was, our response to who Jesus is for us today. Okay? So today, here's the outline I'm going to go through the next half hour. As has been the case in this series, I'm going to talk about some of the historical elements related to Jesus' death. Some of the, especially the external historical elements that are around Jesus' death. Number two, I'm going to look at Jesus' own understanding of his death. What was Jesus' understanding about his own death within his life? And then number three, I want to talk briefly about the necessity of Jesus' death. Have you thought about that before? The necessity of Jesus' death. And then finally, I want to take some time to apply it personally to us. How, why, what does that mean for us? Okay? So let's look at some of the historical elements of Jesus' death. The bare historical facts, just the very, very barest historical facts that nobody, no historian who has any interest in history at all would disagree with. First of all, that there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth who lived and died in history in our world. There was a man who lived and died, Jesus of Nazareth. Number two, Jesus died in the year 30 CE or 33 CE, Common Era, We don't know exactly which one of those because our sources are a bit ambiguous. Our historical sources are a bit ambiguous. So it's one of those. Scholars and historians think it's either 30 or 33 AD. So in the sense that we know when he died, we don't know exactly which day or what year it was, but we know that he died and was one of these years. That is another historical fact that nobody would dispute. Now, I want to just read a quote to us. This is an external source, historical source from Tacitus, just to give us some flavor of the historical time. This is a Roman historian, so this is not in the Bible, but this is a second source. So remember, we talked about history and how if you have multiple sources, that verifies or confirms a history. So this is Tacitus, who was a Roman historian authorized by the court of Rome. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero, who was an emperor during Jesus, in the early Christian church, after Jesus' time, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, that is Jesus, from whom the name Christian had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. And he goes on. He's describing the Roman emperors at that time, and here he's describing the Roman Emperor Nero and how he had dealt with some of the fires that were incited, were started in that city. And Nero blamed the Christians. And this was recorded by Tacitus. So just sort of in passing, verifying the existence of Christians, and especially that this leader of this group of Christians suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, the emperor during that time, at one of the governors, Pontius Pilate. Now, this is something that's very common to Christians. We know this is in our creeds that we talk about. So again, this is one of the sources, the historical sources, that confirm that Jesus died, he was executed here for the extreme penalty. And here it doesn't say exactly, but what were our other sources in the Bible tell us, it was for, and this is the third fact, insurrection. So there were two men who were crucified next to Jesus. The Bible calls them robbers. In fact, the word in the Greek means more than just a robber, but really it's kind of like a bandit, a kind of a political, which has political significance. So someone who was not just like a thief, but someone who was causing mischief politically. And so really, the people that Jesus was crucified with were actually themselves insurrectionists. And then there's that story in the Gospels that there is someone who's released on the Passover day. This is a custom of the Jews that Rome was trying to appease the Jews, and they would release one of the prisoners. And the person who was released, his name was Barabbas. But again, he wasn't just any kind of a criminal. Here, Mark 15:6, I want to read to you. Now at the feast, he, that is Pontius Pilate, used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. So the person whose life was given really almost in exchange for Jesus, because Jesus was offered Pilate was offering Jesus freedom, offering to free Jesus to the Jewish elders, and they were saying, no, release to us Barabbas instead. He himself was an insurrectionist, tried for the crime of insurrection, of treason against the government. So the people beside Jesus who's crucified with him, insurrectionists. The charge against Jesus, insurrection. The person who really that Jesus took his place was an insurrectionist. So it's pretty clear the charge against Jesus and the official reason for his being executed, this crime of insurrection, this crime of trying to raise rebellion against the Roman Empire. That's the third fact that we are pretty confident about historically. Jesus of Nazareth lived and died. Jesus of Nazareth lived and died sometime either in the year 30 or 33 AD under Pontius Pilate. And thirdly, the official reason given for his death and execution was insurrection. Okay, that's the larger historical context. Now, I want to take a step into the biblical text and think about what was Jesus' self-understanding. This is looking at it from 1,000 miles away from the government of Rome. This is why Jesus was crucified. But why was Jesus crucified in his own understanding? What was the significance of his own death with respect to his larger mission in life? Okay, I want to look at 3 pieces of data here in the Bible. The first is the Last Supper. So the Last Supper represents actually a very, very ancient tradition. So there are different layers in the biblical text, we believe, as we think about the ancient, just the way that the text was passed on to us in the ancient world. But the Last Supper, because of its liturgical structure and because of its placement in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 as one of the traditions that was passed down from the disciples, Peter and the apostles, to Paul, we think that liturgy is a very, very ancient liturgy. It goes right back to the earliest days of the birth of the church. And again, we have multiple sources here. So that night that Jesus is betrayed, he has one final meal with his disciples. It's a Passover meal, a special Passover meal. And at the Passover, we know what the Passover is about in the Exodus. The Passover meal, what happens is that God is calling his people, Israel, out of Exodus, and he gives them one final meal. He commands them to have one final meal. At that meal, there is a lamb, which is killed, slaughtered. And then that lamb is the central focus point of that meal. And in this meal, Jesus says, and I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 26, verse 26. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." He took a cup and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them saying, Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And that rite is preserved by the early church. Those words that Jesus speaks to his disciples are preserved by the early church. And then this is what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. "For I received from the Lord," this is Paul speaking about the traditions that's passed down to him, "what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is a new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" Now, you'll notice that both of these versions are slightly different. And that's actually a strength for us historically because they represent different historical sources for us. But they're essentially saying the same thing. So what that tells us is that this tradition goes back very, very early. This is the tradition that Paul received from the apostles. And so we know from his biographical details in Galatians that Paul went to visit the apostles. And so biblical scholars think that we can trace the traditions that Paul received to within maybe 6 months of this time of Jesus' crucifixion, as early as 6 months. So in terms of historical data, this is absolutely unheard of. Like in the ancient world, we sometimes have sources that go back a couple of centuries to the event, within a couple of centuries, sometimes within many centuries, maybe half a millennia from the event, describing the actual event. But what we have here is a historical source within maybe 6 months, certainly within a few years of the actual event. So in other words, historically, this is very, very reliable and credible. So a couple other things here. First, remember the context of this meal is Passover. What's going on at Passover? There's this lamb that's killed. They're eating this lamb. But within this liturgy, within the story of Passover that's recounted in the Gospels as Jesus is having that Last Supper with them, nowhere is a lamb ever mentioned. There is no lamb. That's not part of this liturgy. That's not part of this meal that we know of. Instead, Jesus points to himself. And he says, "This is my body broken for you, given for you. This is my blood shed for you." That lamb, to the first century Jewish mind during Passover, represented some kind of sacrifice in which God was bringing his people out of Egypt. But the context here is transforming these details, these elements. Jesus is not talking about a Passover lamb bringing them out of Israel or a sacrifice for them. He's talking about something else. Himself, his own body, his own blood shed for them and given for them. In fact, in the Gospel of John, John is so interested in this Passover theme that he moves, we think probably he moves the Passover meal from Passover to the day before Passover so that when Jesus is crucified is exactly the time when they would be having Passover. Another way to say that Jesus is the Passover lamb. He is the sacrifice for us. That's the first biblical data that I want to talk about. The second one is the first prediction that we had Claire read out to us from Mark chapter 8, verse 27 to 31. I'm going to read out the last verse to us again. "And Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again." So in the flow of the narrative of the Gospels, Jesus teaches, he does miracles, he signs, people are coming to him, they're receiving healing from him. And then at one point in the Synoptic Gospels, there's this kind of a turn. He's turning his face, it says in the Gospel of Luke, towards Jerusalem. And he's heading now, he's got this mission, he's going towards Jerusalem, and he starts to predict what is going to happen there. 3 times, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us, he makes this prediction. This is the first one. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. According to these predictions in the Bible, Jesus knows what's going to happen to him in Jerusalem. Jesus is predicting what is going to happen to him in Jerusalem. He's going to suffer, he's going to be rejected, and he's going to be killed. He's going to be executed. And actually, this text that we have, anytime you have the Son of Man, this is considered one of the Son of Man sayings. Anytime you have that phrase, Son of Man, biblical scholars think, okay, actually, that's a sign of authenticity. Why? Because in the first century, that title, Son of Man, was not used for the Messiah. The Son of Man, that phrase comes from Daniel chapter 7, and what's going on in Daniel chapter 7 is that there's this figure that's brought before God in exaltation in Daniel 7. He's called the Son of Man. But Jewish interpreters in that time, they didn't really know what to make of this. Was it an angel? Maybe it's God himself. Maybe it's a human figure. But the one thing they didn't think was that this was the Messiah, because this is some exalted figure in heaven. That's not what the Messiah is. The Messiah is someone on earth who's going to come and restore the fortunes of Israel. So the Son of Man title is nowhere used for Messiah. And then the early church, they call Jesus Lord. They call him Christ. They call him Messiah. They never call him Son of Man. Where did this phrase, Son of Man, come from? Jesus. And nobody uses it after that. But the Gospels record that Jesus used it of himself. There are other reasons for why we think he used it of himself. But the key point I want to make is that these Son of Man phrases, according to historians and biblical scholars, will help us identify what are really historical elements in the gospel narrative that are pointing towards as early data as possible. So right from Jesus himself. And 3 times we have these predictions. Here is the first one. The Son of Man, he's talking about himself, must suffer and die. And here's the third one I want to talk about. Mark 10:45. This is not one of the predictions, although it's related to one of the predictions, the third one. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. As a ransom for many. Now, that word ransom is used in the first century for the freeing of slaves. So in the ancient world, one of the things that would happen fairly regularly was one nation would conquer another, and often that nation that was conquered, they would become slaves. Now, slavery in the ancient world was not exactly like what we think of in terms of, say, African-American slavery in the United States, but slaves could kind of work their way towards freedom. And slaves could be emancipated, they could be freed. And this was a ransom, this was a word that was used for that payment that was necessary for their freedom. For Jesus, so Jesus says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a payment for the freedom of slaves, as a ransom for many. So what is going on in Jesus' mind here, according to the biblical text? The best sources that we have that go right back to the first century, right back probably to Jesus himself. He knows he's going to suffer. He knows he's going to die. And there is a sense of sacrifice about his life. And there's a sense of being a ransom for others. And the forgiveness of sins that his life and his death will bring about for others in that first text we read from the Last Supper. So basically there are 2 options here. The historical world around Jesus, some of that interprets Jesus' death as he was an insurrectionist, that he went to Jerusalem to raise up a rebellion against Rome. And that's the charge officially against him. That's the charge that sticks. And as Mike Woods will talk about, that is the charge, in fact, that is written on the cross that's above his head. in his crucifixion. So that means, if that is true, what happens is Jesus was an insurrectionist. He died as a failure, as a failed Messiah in the worldly sense. He was trying to raise up 12 disciples that represented Israel, right? We talked about that. And his goal was actually to go to Jerusalem to stir up some more resistance against Rome, to overturn the temple, and to raise up a population, a following for him, and eventually to make it all the way to Rome and overturn Rome in the sense that Judaism would no longer, the Jewish people would no longer need to be living under the fear and the threat of Rome. That is what they say. That is what the charge against him officially is. The other historical option here is that this is what some people thought about him. This is what they charged him with, but they did not really truly understand what Jesus was really about. And if we look at Jesus' life more closely, then we begin to understand what that might really be about. Yes, he is the Messiah. Yes, he is the fulfillment of the Old Testament story. Yes, he's come to free them. But the freedom was not merely a political freedom. Something much, much deeper than that was going on. Jesus was not trying to raise up a rebellion to go to Jerusalem and then to Rome thereafter. He's going to Jerusalem to die. That was his purpose. And somehow, in this death, his life becomes a ransom. Somehow, in this death, others are freed, and our sins are forgiven. And others thought that he was they mistook what he was really about and even blamed him and accused him of things that he was not really about. And yet, what really needed to happen was that he did need to die. He did need to die. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. But before that, those are the two historical options we have before us. The best historical data points towards this second option, that Jesus, in fact, knew what he was going to do. He knew he came to die, and that's what happened to him. Now, those around him didn't really understand. Even his closest followers didn't really understand what that was about. The other historical option is that all of this, all of what the Bible writes, is really reconstruction. And that really he was just a failed Messiah in history. I think the best historical reconstruction is actually that Jesus knew what was going on and he went to die. Now, this third and final question, the necessity of Jesus' death. Why was Jesus' death necessary? Have you ever thought about that? Why was it necessary? Why was it necessary that he give his life as a ransom to free us, to give his life as a sacrifice? Why did it have to happen like that? Couldn't God just kind of snap his fingers and we'd be forgiven, or God snap his fingers and then sin will be gone and the world would be made new again? I don't know. Maybe that's a possibility. Why did Jesus have to die? In fact, that's a very, very difficult question to answer, and something of a mystery, I think, theologically. I think the best thing I can answer, the best way that I can answer, I can think of, is that sometimes really, really hard things need to happen because really, really bad problems need to be solved. Sometimes you just have to go through a lot of suffering and trial and pain in order to achieve and accomplish what you are trying to achieve and accomplish. And you can't have shortcuts. If you do, eventually things will just break down again. And I think that's maybe what the biblical story is trying to tell us. God creates the world. Humanity, he creates humanity. The intention is for us to live in harmony and fellowship with one another and with him and with the world, the created world. But very quickly it breaks down. And so God instead, he chooses one nation from among the nations that are just doing their own thing. And with that nation, he's trying to teach them how he wants them to live. Again, with each other, and how he wants them to worship and serve him as the one true God. But as we see the history unfold, again, it breaks down. And so what happens, the New Testament tells us, is that these solutions are not deep enough for the problem. And so what needs to happen is God sends his own son, his very own son, whom he loves, to be the solution for the problem of Israel, which was supposed to be the solution for the problem of humanity. And how do you conquer death? Seems like the Bible is saying the only way to really conquer death is not just to erase it and make it go away, but actually to go through it, and then come out the other side. That's God's solution to the problem. So why did Jesus have to die? I don't know why he had to die, but I know that if there were some other way, surely God would have chosen it. So therefore, Jesus' death must have had to happen. And that says something, I think, about the severity of the problem that is trying to be resolved. The severity of sin which is residing within us. Okay, let's take some time to apply and think about our own lives. This is really the story of Jesus and what he came to do and what we think he was about, what he thinks, or what we think that he was about. First application I have is that I think sometimes our own problems require radical solutions. Our own problems often require radical solutions. And sometimes we like to take shortcuts with our own problems. I confess, I love to take shortcuts. So whenever I drive my kids, we always try to take the quickest route possible. Like we make it a game. If I can beat Google Maps, then I win. Like in terms of the ETA. So I love to take shortcuts. But sometimes taking shortcuts is the wrong way to go about things. There may be some challenges in our lives that we just can't take shortcuts with. Jesus didn't take shortcuts. God did not take shortcuts. He knew what his mission was, and he went to accomplish it. So the first question I have for us today is, where are we possibly taking shortcuts in our lives? What are the places where we're tempted to kind of short-circuit the process and want to do things our own way? Where are we maybe applying Band-Aid solutions where surgery might actually be needed? That's the first question I have to ask you to reflect. Where might that be in your life? The second one, similar to that path to new life might be painful. So where are we avoiding pain in our lives? The path to new life might be painful. Where are we possibly avoiding pain in our lives that we should not be, that we need to go through instead of go around? Maybe what are the painful conversations that we need to have, the hard decisions that we need to make? What does surrender in your life, what does that look like? Some of those painful moments that you might need to go through rather than around. And the third question of reflection I have for us, not really a reflection anymore, a question anymore, but really a statement of truth. Jesus' suffering and his death, he offers us hope in our places of suffering, in our places of pain. So where do you need hope in your life? Right? Jesus didn't just talk about going to die. He didn't just talk about suffering, but he went through it. He experienced it. And so the encouragement, I think, for us is that if we invite him into those places of pain in our lives that seem to not be able to be changed, that are resistant to any kind of change, that Jesus is with us in those places. He offers us hope. He offers us his presence. So where are those places that you need hope?